So here's the deal. More. Here's the deal, Lauren. The book, you told me the book is about doubt. And it's called Notes on a Mid-Faith Crisis. And the publisher really sells it as basically like what happens when you're doubting. But you actually don't talk that much about doubt. Now here's what you don't do. You don't talk about an interventionist God like breaking into our space-time continuum and making you feel better or bringing you back from the dead so you can talk to a 5-year-old who saw the light. Or like, you don't talk about God in that way.
Right.
But you don't really deal with doubt either. It's kind of like your life absent God.
Well, what was actually surprising to me in this whole experience of, I mean, I don't even know really exactly what to call this experience. I feel like to call it the dark night of the soul is overdoing it a little bit. And yet I feel like to call it my dry spell is not adequate. So somewhere in between dark night of the soul and dry spell is the terrain that we're talking about. And what was surprising to me about myself is that I would have told you 6-7 years ago, I would have told you that my faith commitments were independent of my feelings. And this is like part of my formation as a liturgical person. It's also part of my formation as someone who read Wendell Berry, et cetera, right? And it turned out that I was wrong about that. It turned out that my sense of the reality of Christian claims was much more dependent, not wholly dependent, but much more dependent on my feeling subjectively something of God's nearness than I had known. And so when that feeling, and this now seems like, in hindsight, this seems like really immature, but when that feeling of God's nearness evaporated, vanished, when I smothered it, I mean, I don't know exactly what the language is, but when I stopped feeling it, it really threw my beliefs, if you will, into something of a crisis. And I wouldn't have expected that about myself. I didn't know that my own feelings of God's intimacy were so necessary for my creedal commitments. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, because, you know, those of us who've been in Campus Crusade, and, you know, you have enough experience with evangelicalism to know this, but there's this train, Doug Paget writes about it in one of his books, about this train that's fact, faith, and feeling is the caboose. You don't need it. You need facts and you need faith, but you don't need feeling. And, you know, he tries to debunk that in his book. I think a lot of us have come to that point of saying, what do you... in fact, I'm writing a book right now on prayer, as I've talked to you a little bit about it, but it's like, how do you continue to pray when there's no empirical evidence? You might call it feeling, I might call it empirical evidence, that there's an interventionist God who does stuff because we ask that deity to do it.
Right.
So why the hell, why keep practicing? And I will say that one of the things I resonated with in your book is that I spend more of my life agnostic, more of my waking hours, I'm an agnostic than I am a fideist or a believer. And yet I continue to, like, I went to church tonight. You know, you went to church today. You served the Eucharist. I took communion. We prayed. We sang songs. Like, I just do all the things that a religious person does in spite of my agnosticism. I don't know if you'd call it doubt or what, the lack of feeling of God, but so, I don't really have a question there. It's just like a confession that I resonate with that part of the book. But a lot of times I think, like, why do I keep living a life after a religious pattern?
Well, and I think, at least for me, there are lots of answers to that question, or lots of parts of an answer. But one of them is, like, I seem to just be a religious person. That just seems to be part of my lifelong makeup. The religions in question have changed. But it is really impossible for me to imagine my life without religious choreography and religious community, and not in some mere way, right? This is not a book about she's merely performing the motions. She's merely going to church. Like, I don't think there's anything mere about it. Like, I think it is completely abundant. And I mean, just in church this morning, I was thinking, and very few people at my small parish church, which I call Holy Comforter and still, very few people at that church, I think, even know this. Like, that church saved my life, like, over and over weekly over this period of several years. And I guess I just don't believe that a garden club or a chess club or a book group would have quite saved my life in the same way.
But is it the people in that group who saved your life, or is it the deity that animates that group that saved your life?
That's a totally false question, right? It's the people, it's the deity, it's the way your body moves in church, it's what you put in your mouth in church, it's the words you hear, it's also the fact that, like, we are busy people, and some intuition gets us to church every week. And maybe that's no better than, like, trusting my feeling, but, like, I have this instinct, I have this pull, and I just think it's all of those things together, right? It's the people, it's the worship, it's the prayer, it's the God.
Okay, but that intuition, like that pull, seems to pull on less and less people every year. Like, less and less people in our culture seem to have that pull to go to church every week. And especially your type of church and my type of church.
You know. So I don't.
So when do you look in the mirror and say, I'm living a life of self-delusion, like this isn't resonating with other people? It's not clicking for people.
Well, I'm nowhere near saying that. I mean, it's resonating with the 12 people that I just went to my 4 p.m. adult Sunday school class with, and I don't really need it to resonate with 9 zillion people. Like, that community of 12 people gathered for 2 hours to discuss Thomas Breidenthal's book on Christian households, you know, then that's sufficient. I mean, I do feel confused about what to think about sort of numbers and mainline Protestantism, right? Like, I dearly love the Episcopal Church. I want there to be an Episcopal Church in 50 years. I understand that a lot of our churches in my denomination and others are numerically declining. I know I should be really worried about it, but some part of me just is not worried about it. I feel like it's God's church. We can't kill it. You know, I go to this church that has 175 people on a Sunday. It's not exploding with numbers or money or programs. And I guess it just doesn't worry me that much. I can't get energized about, oh my goodness, fewer people are attracted to mainline Christianity. I mean, occasionally I get energized about it, but mostly, like, not so much.
I mean, the only way I get energized or exercised about it is by thinking, like, why? It seems real important to me, but it's just not that important to other people. Am I kind of deluding
Except
myself?
You know that it's super important to some people, so it's not important.
Oh my gosh, Lauren, I mean, flying model airplanes is super important to some people. I mean, you could.
So why is that the ratifying? There's some magical number where if it were important to that many people, then that would ratify.
Not magical number.
I mean, the numbers question is not the right question, maybe.
No, I don't think it's numbers. Probably it could also be passion, which also seems to be lacking in the main line. But let me ask you this: I'm an outspoken proponent of the end of ordination. And you and many of my friends, I mean, you're not alone in this, but you end the book by saying how much you're looking forward to. I think you write it in there. Maybe it's in the Q&A thing at the end about how much you're looking forward to being ordained. And since you finished the book, you've been ordained. And what's so great about that? Like what was so compelling for you to go through all that stuff? Because you're not a parish priest, so the ordination wasn't so you could like get a job and be part of the Episcopal pension fund. So what was it? What drew you to that?
So personally, at this point, having been ordained for a whopping 2 months, I don't have much to say about it other than that I find it really fun, which I realize is not an especially sophisticated answer. I was in the ordination process for like a decade, and there were moments in that process that felt like real discernment, and there were moments that felt like bureaucratic annoyance, and there were moments that felt like not much of anything at all.
Yet you stuck with it.
And call is not a word I use very easily or comfortably. But you can't get through an Episcopal ordination process without thinking about what you think about the word call. And I remember saying to my spiritual director once that I wasn't sure that I could say that I thought that God was calling me to the priesthood, by which I mean, I don't actually really think that God cares if I'm a priest or not. I think I have friends who are priests, and I look at these friends and I think God really does care about those people being priests. Like, those people were made to be priests, and that is what God wants. I feel like God was saying to me in this process, like, if you want to be a priest, great, we can roll with that. If you want to do something else, fine, that's cool too. So I was talking about this with my spiritual director and saying, like, so can I really say that I believe that God is calling me to this if what I'm really saying is God is delightedly, benignly indifferent to whether or not I'm ordained? And the conversation went on, and then at one point I said, I believe that God is the yeast or the leaven in my desire to be a priest. And my spiritual director stopped me and said, that's a description of call. Like, you can talk about leaven if you don't want to use this other word that makes you freaked out. So I just was persistently drawn to sort of word and table. I was drawn to preach, and the Eucharist, as I write about in the book, was more than almost anything else sustaining to me in a way that I just sound like an Episcopalian now. I can't really explain exactly what it was in the Eucharist, but the Eucharist I would go to church, I wouldn't really pray, I wasn't really listening to the sermons, I was wool gathering, and I knew that I needed to be at the table and would be met at the table. Again, that just makes me sound like an Episcopalian, but I am one. So.
No, I mean, I have experiences. I remember putting ash on people's foreheads. We don't have clergy per se at Solomon's Porch, but when I was on staff of a church, I put on a robe and walked out there on, Ash Wednesday and put ash on people's foreheads, and I remember that feeling of serving people.
It's funny to me that several people have said to me, like, who've read the book, you never really come to Jesus in this book. And to me, and there are numerous chapters actually about Jesus in the book, but like the 3 chapters about the Eucharist are chapters about Jesus. I mean, that's how I understand them. I understand that not everyone will understand them that way.
Yeah, not everyone will. And it's a little estery, like you talk about God without ever mentioning God. I mean, you can, But let me ask you this as a last question, because as well...
Then we get to do part 3.
What do you want to talk about in part 3?
I'll come up with something.
The end of part 2 is, you also have a couple chapters about prayer, and so my question to you is, why do you pray?
Are you going to use my answer in your own book?
It's possible.
So first of all, I don't always pray. I think I pray in part because I have been a person who has been praying since I was a child, and I have a habit that I am glad for, but the habit is insufficient. I mean, I think people have asked me, like, how does this book how are you revising previously held thoughts in this book, or how does this book reflect change in your thinking or your theology? And I actually think the most important change it reflects is, I, like you, have been a big proponent of spiritual disciplines language. And the whole category of spiritual disciplines and the language, spiritual disciplines will keep you going and sustain you through your periods of doubt and so forth and so on. Except when I hit such a period, it didn't work. Like, maybe I hadn't been practicing these spiritual disciplines long enough, but it in fact proved impossible and or close to impossible to make myself show up for these supposed spiritual disciplines like prayer when I thought it was all hogwash or alienated from me or etc. So I think partially I pray because I have a habit that is an incomplete answer. I pray because I am committed to living my life in a story that says I was made to worship. And I pray because I believe that showing up for the words of prayer pulls me into worship even when my heart, head, consciousness, etc. are elsewhere. And because this is the story I'm really committed to wanting to live my life in. And this story says, this is what we were made for. We were made to worship. One of the ways we learn how to do that on earth is pray. Why do you pray?
Well, your description of prayer is very therapeutic, and I just don't think that's that's a fine reason to pray. It's just not the biblical reason to pray.
What is the biblical reason?
That's what you're going to have to read. You're going to have to find my book, and then you're going to write an endorsement, and you're going to say on the back of the book, this is a book to which I will return
over and over for the rest of my life. But just give me a hint. Give me a clue. No prelude?
You'll have to see. Thanks, Lauren Winter.
You don't know the answer yet. That's a cop-out.
I don't know the answer. That's actually true. Thanks.
Bye.